The city of Arendor rose in terraces of glass and pale stone, its upper districts suspended in the air by silent gravitic engines that glowed faintly at dusk like captive moons. From the lowest streets, one could look upward and see layers of civilization stacked above each other. Markets humming with drone traffic, gardens cultivated in rings of artificial sunlight, and at the highest point, the royal complex, its translucent domes reflecting the slow drift of clouds engineered to regulate the climate. Marcus rarely looked up. His world existed several levels below the sunlit terraces, in the archival vaults carved into the oldest foundations of the city. The archives were vast, a labyrinth of climate-controlled corridors where the air smelled faintly of metal, paper, and the faint ozone of preservation fields. Shelves stretched upward in towering rows, some containing physical volumes bound in materials older than most nations, others holding crystalline memory prisms that glowed faintly with stored data. Marcus liked it there. Books did not interrupt you with political ambitions. Records did not demand favors. And ancient documents, unlike living people, rarely changed their minds halfway through a conversation. He was seated at a narrow work table, carefully examining a star map recovered from a survey vessel that had vanished 2 centuries earlier. The map was projected in midair, lines of pale blue light tracing routes through long collapsed trade corridors. Marcus leaned closer, adjusting the projection with a small gesture. If this navigator was any worse at plotting coordinates, he muttered to himself, he might have discovered an entirely new galaxy by accident. A voice behind him said, "That would have made the report more interesting." Marcus turned, already smiling slightly, because there were only a few people in the archives who spoke like that. Queen Lyssa stood a few steps away, unattended, as she often was when she visited this part of the palace. She wore simple attire rather than ceremonial robes, a dark blue coat edged with silver thread. At first glance, she looked entirely human, but her long, elegant ears, tapering gracefully behind her hair, marked her unmistakably as Arendori. Her expression was thoughtful, almost relaxed, as though the silence of the archives allowed her to breathe more easily. Marcus inclined his head in a respectful greeting, though not the elaborate bow expected in formal settings. "Your Majesty," he said, "if explorers began discovering galaxies by mistake, historians would never get any rest." "I was under the impression historians never rest anyway," Lyssa replied, stepping closer to examine the projection. "That is slander," Marcus said gravely. "We rest at least once every 3 or 4 days, whether we need it or not." She laughed softly, and the sound echoed faintly in the quiet chamber. They began discussing the map as they often did when she visited. Lyssa had an unusual interest in history, not the grand, simplified narratives taught in academies, but the messy, contradictory details preserved in original records. She asked questions most nobles would never think to ask. Why a minor trade agreement had failed, how a small cultural misunderstanding had escalated into conflict, why certain explorers had chosen routes that seemed irrational. Marcus answered as best he could, occasionally admitting when he did not know. He never pretended certainty for the sake of impressing her, and she seemed to appreciate that more than any display of knowledge. After some time, Lyssa leaned against the table, studying the glowing star map in silence. "There are days," she said quietly, "when I think the past is easier to understand than the present." Marcus considered this. "The past," he said, "has the advantage of being finished. The present insists on continuing." She smiled faintly at that, but there was a trace of weariness in her eyes. Marcus noticed it, but did not comment. One of the first things he had learned about Lyssa was that she valued conversation, not interrogation. A small maintenance drone drifted past at that moment, emitting a polite chime as it scanned the shelves for dust accumulation. Marcus watched it glide by and said, "I sometimes envy those machines." Lyssa raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "They have very clear purposes. If I ever drifted through corridors emitting polite chimes, people would find it alarming." "I might find it refreshing," she said. "Then I shall begin practicing immediately," Marcus replied solemnly, making a soft chiming noise under his breath. Lyssa covered her mouth to suppress a laugh, and for a moment she looked less like a queen and more like a scholar sharing a private joke. Their conversation continued until a discreet signal chimed on Lyssa's wrist console, reminding her of another obligation. She straightened slightly, the faint tension of duty returning to her posture. "I must go," she said. "There is always another meeting waiting." Marcus inclined his head. "History will remain here, Your Majesty. It is very patient." "I know," she said softly. "That is why I keep coming back." She left, her footsteps fading into the corridor, and the archives seemed a little quieter in her absence. Marcus returned to the star map, but his thoughts lingered on the expression he had seen in her eyes. Not sadness exactly, but a kind of exhaustion that came from being observed too closely for too long. Several days later, an announcement appeared on every public display in the palace. The grand court function would be held at the end of the week. Attendance was required for all administrative personnel of sufficient rank, which to Marcus's mild surprise included archivists. He stared at the notice for a long moment, then sighed. Court functions meant formal attire, assigned seating, and conversations conducted with the careful precision of diplomatic negotiations. Marcus owned exactly one formal coat, which he suspected had been designed by someone who believed breathing was an optional activity. On the evening of the function, he stood in his quarters, struggling with the coat's collar. "If I perish," he told his reflection, "let it be known that I was defeated by tailoring." Eventually, he managed to fasten the garment and made his way to the Great Hall. The hall was already filled with nobles, dignitaries, and representatives from distant systems. Chandeliers of suspended plasma drifted overhead, casting shifting patterns of light across the polished floor. Musicians played softly on instruments that produced harmonics too complex for any traditional scale. Marcus located his assigned seat at a table near the far wall, among clerks, engineers, and other individuals whose presence was necessary but not particularly celebrated. He sat down with a quiet sense of relief. From this distance, he could observe the proceedings without being required to participate in them. A fellow archivist leaned toward him and whispered, "If anyone asks, we are discussing extremely important documents." "What documents?" Marcus whispered back. "I have no idea," the archivist said, "but we will look very serious while discussing them." Marcus nodded. "An excellent strategy." The musicians finished a piece and a herald stepped forward to announce the arrival of the Queen. The hall rose as one, the sound of chairs moving echoing like distant thunder. Marcus stood with the others, his gaze shifting toward the great entrance at the far end of the hall. Queen Lyssa entered, dressed in formal robes that shimmered like starlight on water. She moved with calm, measured grace, acknowledging the assembled court with a slight inclination of her head. Protocol dictated that she would ascend the elevated throne prepared at the front of the hall. Marcus expected nothing else. Yet as Lyssa reached the center of the hall, she slowed. Her gaze moved across the assembled guests, not in the practiced sweep of ceremony, but in a searching, deliberate way, as though she were looking for something specific. Marcus felt a faint, inexplicable unease, though he could not have said why. And then her eyes found him. For a moment, Marcus was certain he had misunderstood. The Queen looked in his direction often enough during public events, he told himself. It meant nothing. She was simply surveying the hall. Then she began walking toward him. Not toward the throne, not toward the ambassadors or the ranking ministers waiting near the front. Toward the back of the hall, toward the tables reserved for minor officials, toward the archivists and technicians who suddenly found themselves sitting very straight and staring at their plates as if plates were fascinating objects worthy of intense scholarly study. Marcus considered the possibility that he had accidentally done something illegal without noticing. Perhaps misfiled a document of catastrophic importance. Perhaps misinterpreted a footnote that had offended an entire planetary delegation. He briefly wondered whether it was possible to faint politely. The sound in the hall shifted, not growing louder but thinner, like air being drawn from a chamber. Conversations faltered. Glasses paused halfway to lips. The musicians, uncertain, allowed the last notes of their melody to fade into silence. Lyssa reached the table and stopped beside Marcus. Up close, he could see that her expression was calm, almost relieved, as if she had finally arrived somewhere she had been trying to reach for a long time. "Good evening, Marcus," she said. Several people at the table nearly stopped breathing, One man coughed so violently he had to grab his glass to steady himself. Marcus stood automatically, managing a bow that was perhaps less graceful than usual, because his mind was still trying to catch up with reality. "Your Majesty," he said. "Good evening." "I hope I am not interrupting anything important," Lyssa said, glancing at the table. Marcus looked at the half-eaten plate in front of him. "I was in the middle of an extremely delicate negotiation with this roasted vegetable," he said, "but I believe it will forgive the delay." A faint smile touched her lips. Then, without ceremony, she pulled out the chair beside him and sat down. The silence in the hall became absolute. Marcus sat slowly, aware that hundreds of eyes were now fixed on their table. He could feel the weight of attention, like gravity, pressing against his shoulders. "I suspect," he said quietly, "that the throne is currently feeling neglected." "It will survive," Lyssa replied just as quietly. A servant approached, clearly unsure whether to serve the queen here or attempt to persuade her to move. Lyssa accepted a glass of water with a nod, as naturally as if she had always intended to sit at this table. Marcus leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice. "Your Majesty, may I ask why you are sitting here?" Lyssa rested her hands lightly on the table. Her fingers relaxed, and for a moment she did not answer. When she spoke, her voice was soft enough that only he could hear it. "Because I wanted to." Marcus blinked. That was not the sort of explanation one expected from a monarch. She glanced at the hall, at the nobles pretending not to stare, at the ministers attempting to resume conversations that had clearly lost all coherence. Then she looked back at him. "Every conversation in this room," she said quietly, "has a purpose. Every word is weighed, every expression calculated. Even silence is interpreted. It is exhausting." Marcus nodded slowly. "I imagine it would be." "In the archives," she continued, "you argue with me about historical tax reforms." "They were very inefficient reforms," Marcus said automatically. "Yes," she said, and there was the hint of laughter in her voice. "You argue with me. You disagree. You forget sometimes that I am queen." Marcus shifted slightly in his chair. "I never forget," he said. "I simply set it aside when discussing footnotes." "That," Lyssa said softly, "is precisely why I am sitting here." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in Marcus's chest eased, replaced by a strange, quiet understanding. Around them, the function cautiously resumed. Conversations restarted in low voices, though the occasional glance in their direction continued. A musician, perhaps deciding that silence was more uncomfortable than music, began playing again, the gentle tones of a stringed instrument drifting through the hall. Marcus picked up his glass, mostly to give his hand something to do. "I should warn you," he said, "that my conversational skills are largely limited to history, astronomy, and complaints about cataloging errors." "That sounds like an improvement," Lyssa said. They began speaking of small things at first, of a newly restored manuscript in the archives, of a cargo vessel that had recently arrived carrying artifacts from a distant system, of a scholar who had spent 3 years attempting to prove that a legendary explorer had never existed, only to discover that the explorer had in fact written a diary complaining about scholars. Lyssa laughed quietly at that. "History," she said, "has an excellent sense of humor." "Yes," Marcus agreed. "Unfortunately, it usually takes a century to deliver the punchline." A group of nobles passed near their table, speaking loudly about trade agreements in what was clearly an attempt to appear unconcerned. One of them glanced at Marcus with an expression of intense curiosity, as though trying to determine what remarkable quality could possibly have drawn the queen here. Marcus leaned slightly toward Lyssa and murmured, "I believe I am being studied." "As what?" she asked. "I am not sure. Possibly a rare species of archivist." "Are archivists rare?" "Only in environments with adequate sunlight," Marcus said gravely. She covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking slightly with suppressed laughter. For the first time since she had entered the hall, Marcus noticed that her posture had changed. The rigid composure of ceremony had softened. She sat more easily now, her shoulders relaxed, her expression unguarded. "Do you know," she said after a moment, "how many people spoke to me today without asking for something?" Marcus considered this. "I hope at least one." "One," she said. "You, 3 days ago, Arguing about navigation errors. Marcus looked down at the table, unsure how to respond to that. I did not come here, Lyssa continued softly, to make a statement. I did not come to shock the court or create rumors. I came because I wanted one evening of ordinary conversation. Marcus nodded slowly. Then we should discuss something completely unimportant. That would be perfect, she said. He thought for a moment. In your opinion, he said, which historical disaster was caused by the smallest initial mistake? Lyssa's eyes brightened with interest. Ah, she said, that is an excellent question. And as they began debating the merits of various catastrophes, some caused by mistranslated signals, others by misaligned jump coordinates, one memorably caused by a ceremonial hat that had offended an entire diplomatic mission, the great hall of Arendor gradually filled once more with the sound of conversation and music. Yet at one small table near the back, the queen of a star-faring civilization and an archivist who preferred footnotes to politics spoke quietly, and for a little while, the weight of crowns and expectations seemed very far away. The debate about historical disasters continued far longer than Marcus expected. Lyssa proved to have an alarming memory for obscure events, and she argued with calm determination that the collapse of the seventh orbital ring had begun, not with the engineering failure everyone blamed, but with a scheduling error that delayed maintenance by exactly 9 minutes. 9 minutes, Marcus said, leaning back slightly. That is either the most tragic 9 minutes in recorded history or the most convenient excuse ever invented by engineers. I assure you, Lyssa replied, engineers rarely invent excuses that make them look worse. That is true, Marcus admitted. Historians, on the other hand, specialize in explanations that make everyone look equally foolish. They shared a quiet smile, and for a moment Marcus almost forgot where they were. Then a ripple of movement passed through the hall, and he noticed that several ministers at a nearby table were whispering intensely while pretending to examine their glasses. Marcus lowered his voice. I believe we are being interpreted. Lyssa followed his glance and gave a faint, amused sigh. Everything is always interpreted. A hovering service drone drifted to their table, projecting a polite tone as it offered a tray of small crystalline desserts that emitted faint wisps of cool vapor. Marcus picked one up, examining it carefully. If this begins glowing, he said, I am putting it back. It is only condensed vapor infused with sweet proteins, Lyssa said. That is exactly what someone would say about something dangerous, Marcus replied. But he tasted it anyway and raised his eyebrows in surprise. All right, I forgive it. Lyssa shook her head, smiling faintly. The music in the hall shifted to a slower, softer arrangement, and conversations began to flow again, though the occasional glance in their direction continued. Marcus noticed that some of the tension had faded. The court, it seemed, had begun to accept the strange reality of the queen sitting at a minor table, though acceptance did not prevent curiosity. After a while, Lyssa rested her chin lightly on her hand and looked across the hall, her expression thoughtful. Do you know what the most exhausting part of this life is? She asked quietly. Marcus considered several possible answers and chose the safest. The clothing? She looked at him in mild surprise. I mean, Marcus added, gesturing discreetly toward the elaborate garments worn by several nobles. I am certain at least 3 people here cannot sit down without assistance. Lyssa laughed softly. That is true, but no. The most exhausting part is never being allowed to be ordinary. Marcus did not answer immediately. The words carried a weight he could not ignore. When I walk into a room, she continued, every conversation changes. People stand differently. They speak differently. Even their thoughts change, because they are no longer speaking to a person. They are speaking to a crown. Marcus glanced at her. And in the archives? In the archives, she said, I am someone who cannot remember the date of the third colonial survey and must ask an archivist for help. Marcus nodded solemnly. A tragic condition. Yes, she said, playing along. Quite embarrassing. A sudden burst of laughter erupted at a nearby table, startling several guests. Marcus looked over and saw a group of junior officers attempting to demonstrate a holographic card game, only to have the projection malfunction and fill the air with enormous animated symbols that drifted slowly toward the ceiling. A maintenance drone immediately descended, emitting an apologetic chime as it began clearing the projections. Marcus watched this with interest. "I must admit," he said, "that if court functions always included giant floating symbols, I would attend more often." "I will make a note," Lyssa said. A servant approached, bowing respectfully. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "the ministers are waiting to present the trade reports." Lyssa met Marcus's eyes briefly, and he could see the hesitation there, the reluctance to return to the endless machinery of obligation. "Tell them," she said calmly, "that I will review the reports in the morning." The servant blinked, clearly surprised, but bowed and withdrew. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You are going to cause several people to lose sleep tonight." "They will survive," she said. Then after a pause, she added, "I have learned that if one never delays anything, one never rests." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the music and the distant hum of the hall's environmental systems. The ceiling above them shimmered faintly as the transparent panels adjusted their opacity, revealing a view of the night sky beyond the city's upper domes. Stars burned in cold brilliance, and far above, a line of cargo vessels moved slowly along a traffic corridor, their engines leaving faint trails of ionized light. Marcus followed her gaze upward. "Sometimes," he said, "I think about how small all of this must look from out there." Lyssa nodded. "And sometimes," she said, "I think about how vast it feels when you are inside it." A pause followed, comfortable rather than awkward. After a while, Marcus said, "May I confess something, Your Majesty?" "You may," she said. "When you walked toward this table," he said, "I was certain I had committed some terrible mistake." Lyssa looked at him in genuine surprise. "Why?" "Because queens do not walk toward archivists," Marcus said simply. She studied him for a moment, then said softly, "Perhaps they should." Marcus did not know how to answer that, so he did what he always did when uncertain. He changed the subject. "Have you ever read the journals of Captain Ilian Vero?" he asked, "the explorer who claimed to have mapped a star that did not exist?" "The same. He spent 20 years defending his discovery, only to learn that the star had been temporarily obscured by a migrating dust cloud." Lyssa smiled faintly. "That must have been embarrassing." "Not at all," Marcus said. "He wrote an entire book about the experience and became more famous than ever." "There is a lesson in that," she said. "Yes," Marcus replied. "If reality contradicts you, write a book." She laughed quietly, and the sound seemed to ease something in both of them. The evening continued, unhurried, the noise of the hall rising and falling like distant waves. Marcus realized with a faint sense of wonder that he was no longer nervous. The queen beside him was no longer an unreachable figure of ceremony, but simply Lyssa, curious, thoughtful, and, in her own quiet way, profoundly tired of being anything other than herself. And as the stars burned above the transparent ceiling and the great hall of Arendor carried on around them, Marcus understood that something small but significant had changed, though he could not yet say exactly what it was. The longer the evening continued, the more the initial shock in the hall began to dissolve into a restless curiosity. Conversations resumed, though many of them now drifted inevitably back to the same subject. Marcus could feel it in the air, like static before a storm. The quiet speculation, the unspoken questions, the persistent glances. He leaned slightly toward Lyssa and murmured, "I believe at least 3 people have constructed elaborate theories about us in the last 5 minutes." "Only 3?" she said. "I am disappointed in their imagination." Marcus hid a smile behind his glass. A group of diplomats passed nearby, speaking in low, careful voices. One of them, a tall man with a ceremonial sash covered in tiny illuminated insignias, slowed just enough to bow to the queen before moving on. His eyes flicked briefly to Marcus, measuring, calculating, searching for significance where there was none. Marcus waited until the man was out of earshot. "I suspect," he said quietly, "that I am being evaluated as a possible threat to interstellar stability." "That would certainly make your archival work more exciting," Lyssa replied. "Yes," Marcus said. "I could begin misfiling documents on purpose, just to maintain my reputation." Lyssa laughed softly, and again Marcus saw that small but unmistakable change in her expression. the way the lines of strain faded when she allowed herself to forget, even briefly, that she was being watched. A soft chime sounded overhead as one of the environmental systems adjusted the air circulation. The temperature shifted almost imperceptibly, and faint currents of cool air drifted through the hall, carrying the scent of unfamiliar spices from the kitchens below. Marcus noticed Lyssa watching the movement of the air currents, visible only where they disturbed the thin trails of vapor rising from illuminated dishes. "You are observing airflow patterns," he said. "Yes," she admitted. "That is the most scholarly thing I have ever heard a queen confess. I spent part of my childhood dismantling climate regulators," she said calmly. Marcus blinked. "I feel that this is information the court should have been told earlier." "They learned eventually," she said, "after the southern garden experienced unexpected snowfall." Marcus stared at her for a moment, then laughed under his breath. "I am beginning to understand why you enjoy the archives." Before she could reply, a hovering projection sphere descended slowly near the center of the hall, expanding into a three-dimensional display of trade routes and star systems. It rotated silently, lines of light marking shipping corridors, diplomatic zones, and restricted regions. Several ministers gathered beneath it, gesturing as they discussed cargo tariffs and transit regulations. Lyssa glanced at the projection, then back at Marcus. "I am supposed to be there," she said quietly. Marcus followed her gaze. "Yes," he said. "You are." She did not move. After a moment, Marcus said, "Do you want to be there?" Lyssa was silent for a few seconds. Then she said, "No." Marcus nodded once, as if confirming a simple fact. "Then you are in the correct place." She looked at him, and for a brief instant the noise of the hall seemed to fade again, leaving only the quiet understanding between them. A small cleaning drone rolled past their table, paused, and emitted a questioning tone as it scanned the floor. Marcus watched it with interest. "I often wonder," he said, "if these machines judge us." Lyssa raised an eyebrow. "On what basis?" "Spilled food," Marcus said. "They have very high standards." At that moment, as if on cue, someone at a nearby table dropped a utensil, and the drone immediately redirected itself with brisk efficiency. Marcus gestured toward it. "You see? Relentless." Lyssa shook her head, smiling faintly. The music shifted again, this time to a livelier tempo, and a few guests moved toward the open floor at the center of the hall, where a subtle gravitational field adjusted itself to make movement feel almost effortless. Dancers turned in slow, graceful arcs, their garments catching the light of the floating chandeliers. Marcus watched them for a moment. "I am relieved," he said, "that archivists are not expected to dance." "Why?" "Because I would almost certainly injure someone." "I would like to see that," Lyssa said. "I would not," Marcus replied. They fell into another easy silence, and Marcus realized that the weight of the evening had shifted. The initial tension had drained away, replaced by something calmer, almost peaceful. The hall still watched, but the watching had lost its edge. It was no longer shock, but curiosity, and perhaps, in some quiet corners, even a trace of envy. A young attendant approached hesitantly, carrying a tray of small luminous spheres. "Your Majesty," she said, bowing nervously, "would you care for—" Lyssa selected one of the spheres and handed it to Marcus. "You should try this," she said. Marcus examined it carefully. The sphere glowed faintly, its surface swirling with soft colors. "Is it alive?" he asked. "No." "Are you certain?" "Yes." Marcus tasted it cautiously, then blinked in surprise. "It tastes like citrus and starlight." "I am not sure starlight has a flavor," Lyssa said. "It does now," Marcus replied. The attendant, still nervous, allowed herself a small smile before withdrawing. Marcus noticed the exchange and said quietly, "You see people?" Lyssa looked at him. "You notice them," he said. "Most here do not." She was silent for a moment. Then she said, "It is difficult not to notice people when you know how easily they are overlooked." Marcus understood that she was not speaking about attendants or servants alone. The projection sphere at the center of the hall dimmed as the ministers concluded their discussion. The music softened again, and the conversations around them settled into a quieter rhythm. Marcus leaned back slightly, looking up through the transparent ceiling where the stars shone in steady brilliance. A distant patrol ship passed high above, its engines leaving a faint arc of blue light that slowly faded into darkness. "Do you ever wish," he said quietly, "that you could simply leave all of this behind for a while? Not forever, just long enough to remember what silence feels like." Lyssa followed his gaze to the stars. "Yes," she said, "often." Neither of them spoke after that. For a long time they simply sat there side by side, while the great hall of Arendor moved around them in all its glittering complexity. And though the court continued to watch, to speculate, to wonder, the queen and the archivist spoke quietly of distant stars, forgotten histories, and the small, ordinary things that made life feel real. And in that quiet conversation, both of them found a refuge they had not realized they needed. The longer the queen remained at the table, the more the court's curiosity began to evolve into something more active. Whispers traveled in quiet currents, crossing the hall faster than any official message ever could. Marcus could almost feel the weight of speculation forming elaborate structures in the minds of the nobles. Political meanings, hidden motives, secret alliances that existed nowhere except in their imaginations. He leaned slightly toward Lyssa. "I believe," he murmured, "that by tomorrow morning I will have been promoted, disgraced, exiled, and secretly appointed as your chief advisor, all at the same time." Lyssa's eyes glimmered with amusement. "That would be efficient." "I prefer to achieve my catastrophes one at a time," Marcus said. A pair of junior diplomats passed behind them, speaking in hushed voices that were not quite quiet enough. "I must mean something," one of them whispered. "A symbolic gesture," said the other. Marcus waited until they were gone, then said softly, "You see, I have become symbolic. I am not sure what of, but it sounds important." Lyssa rested her hand lightly against her temple, hiding a smile. A moment later, another figure approached their table. An older nobleman whose expression suggested that he had spent the last half hour attempting to decide whether to come over or flee the building entirely. He bowed deeply. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "forgive my intrusion, but the council is concerned that—" Lyssa looked at him calmly. "That I am sitting in a chair?" The nobleman hesitated. "That this may be misinterpreted." Marcus, unable to help himself, said, "I assure you it is being misinterpreted with great enthusiasm." The nobleman looked at him, startled, as though only just realizing Marcus was capable of speech. Lyssa inclined her head slightly. "You may inform the council," she said gently, "that I am quite comfortable where I am." The nobleman bowed again, retreating with visible uncertainty, as if he suspected the laws of the universe might have changed without warning. Marcus exhaled slowly. "I believe I have just participated in diplomacy." "You did very well," Lyssa said. "I said almost nothing." "That is why you did very well." They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the distant hum of the city beyond the walls. Even through the insulated structure of the hall, one could sometimes feel the faint vibrations of traffic lanes high above, where cargo ships moved in endless, silent processions between the orbital elevators and the distant colonies. Marcus found himself thinking about the scale of it all, the vastness of the empire, the endless responsibilities that rested on the shoulders of the woman sitting beside him. He wondered, not for the first time, how anyone endured such weight without breaking. Lyssa seemed to sense the direction of his thoughts. "You are wondering how I tolerate this," she said quietly. Marcus blinked. "Is it that obvious? You always become very quiet when you are thinking about something serious." "That is because my serious thoughts are usually wrong," Marcus said. Lyssa laughed softly, then her expression grew thoughtful. "The truth," she said, "is that I do not tolerate it as well as people believe. There are days when the responsibilities feel like gravity pressing down from all directions." Marcus nodded slowly. "Gravity," he said, "can be resisted, but never ignored." "Exactly." A server arrived with another tray, placing small cups filled with a softly glowing liquid before them. Marcus examined his cautiously. "If this causes me to levitate," he said, "I will be very upset." "It is only infused tea," Lyssa said. Only, Marcus repeated, tasting it carefully. That is precisely what explorers said before drinking things on unfamiliar planets. And yet you drank it? Yes, Marcus said. I am brave in small, unnecessary ways. Lyssa shook her head, smiling faintly. Across the hall, the dancing had grown more animated. The artificial gravity field shifted subtly to create gentle variations in weight, allowing dancers to leap and turn with impossible grace. One pair misjudged the timing of a step and drifted slightly higher than intended, prompting a ripple of laughter as the field corrected itself and lowered them gently back to the floor. Marcus watched this with interest. I once attended a lecture on variable gravity, he said. The speaker accidentally set the demonstration field too high. Half the audience spent the rest of the afternoon stuck to the ceiling. That sounds unpleasant, Lyssa said. They held the rest of the lecture upside down, Marcus replied. The speaker insisted it was an improvement in perspective. Lyssa laughed, and the sound was warmer now, freer than it had been earlier in the evening. For a while they spoke of small things again, of a newly discovered moon whose surface was covered entirely in crystalline forests, of a poet who had attempted to compose an epic in binary code, of the peculiar habits some starship crews had of naming their vessels after desserts. I once saw a freighter called the Indestructible Pudding, Marcus said. Was it indestructible? It exploded, Marcus said. Lyssa covered her mouth, laughing again, and Marcus realized that the weariness in her eyes had faded, replaced by something lighter. The hours passed almost without notice. The hall grew gradually less crowded as some guests departed, their duties completed, their curiosities satisfied or exhausted. Yet many remained, drawn perhaps by the quiet strangeness of the evening, by the sight of a queen sitting not on a throne, but at a simple table, speaking softly with an archivist about stars and history and absurdities. Marcus leaned back in his chair, feeling a rare sense of ease in a place he had always found oppressive. I must confess, he said, this is the most enjoyable court function I have ever attended. How many have you attended? Lyssa asked. This is my second, Marcus admitted. She smiled. Then I am honored to have improved your record by 50%. They fell silent again, not out of awkwardness but out of comfort, watching the slow rhythm of the hall, listening to the distant music and the quiet hum of the city beyond. And in that quiet, Marcus began to understand that what was happening here was not a political gesture, not a calculated act, but something far simpler and far rarer, the choice of one person to spend an evening beside another, simply because the conversation made the world feel a little less heavy. The music softened as the evening drifted deeper into the night, and the vast hall seemed to breathe more slowly, like a great living thing settling into quiet. Many of the most formal guests had already departed, leaving behind smaller clusters of conversation and the faint hum of the environmental systems regulating the atmosphere. The floating chandeliers dimmed slightly, their colors shifting to warmer tones, and through the transparent ceiling, the stars had grown sharper, brighter, as the upper layers of the city adjusted their lighting. Marcus rested his elbows lightly on the table, looking upward. It always surprises me, he said, how quiet the universe looks from a distance. Lyssa followed his gaze. And how noisy it feels from inside it, she said. For a while they simply watched the sky. A distant transport ship crossed the stars, its ion trail stretching behind it like a line drawn across a dark glass. Marcus wondered where it was going. What distant station or colony waited at the end of its journey? What lives were unfolding there, unnoticed by anyone in this hall? A faint vibration passed through the floor as one of the orbital elevators engaged far above the city, carrying cargo and passengers into the darkness beyond the atmosphere. The sensation was so subtle most people never noticed it, but Marcus had spent enough time in the lower levels to recognize the distant mechanical pulse. Lyssa noticed his expression. You felt it too, she said. I always do, Marcus replied. It reminds me that the city is only a small part of everything. She nodded slowly. That thought is both comforting and terrifying. A small maintenance drone rolled past their table, pausing to scan the floor. Marcus watched it with mild fascination. I sometimes think these machines understand us better than we understand ourselves. Lyssa raised an eyebrow. In what way? They observe quietly, they repair what is broken, and they never attend court functions. That last quality is particularly admirable, she said. Marcus leaned back in his chair, stretching slightly. I must confess, he said, that I expected to spend this evening counting the number of minutes until I could leave without appearing rude. And now? Now I am considering whether it would be rude to remain here until morning. Lyssa smiled faintly, but there was a thoughtful look in her eyes, as if the idea appealed to her more than she wished to admit. At a nearby table, a group of young engineers had begun an animated discussion about the design of a new survey vessel. Their voices carried just enough to reach Marcus and Lyssa in fragments, terms like gravitational harmonics, long-range sensor arrays, and navigation through unstable wormholes. Marcus tilted his head, listening. I envy them, he said quietly. Because they travel, Lyssa asked. Because they build things, Marcus said. Historians only study what has already happened. Engineers shape what will happen. Lyssa considered this. And yet, she said, without historians, no one would remember what was shaped. Marcus inclined his head slightly. A fair point. Perhaps we are both necessary. A server approached with a fresh pot of tea, moving carefully as though still slightly awed by the Queen's presence at this unlikely table. Marcus thanked the server with a nod, and the young man blinked in surprise before hurrying away. You see, Lyssa said softly, you do it without thinking. Do what? You treat people as though they matter. Marcus looked down at the cup in his hands. They do matter. Yes, she said quietly. They do. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hall felt quieter now, the earlier tension long gone, replaced by a calm that seemed almost fragile. Lyssa rested her hands on the table, tracing the faint patterns in the polished surface. When I was a child, she said, I believed being queen would mean having freedom. I thought it meant being able to go anywhere, to do anything. Marcus glanced at her. And now? Now I know it means the opposite. Marcus considered this in silence. He wanted to offer some comforting observation, some clever remark that would lighten the weight of her words, but nothing came to mind. So he simply said, I am sorry. Lyssa looked at him, and there was gratitude in her expression, not for the apology itself, but for the simplicity of it. Across the hall, the musicians began packing their instruments, their work nearly finished. The last melodies lingered in the air like fading echoes, and the dancers drifted away from the floor, laughing softly among themselves. Marcus watched them go. It is strange, he said. An event that seemed so immense a few hours ago now feels very small. Time does that, Lyssa said. It reduces even the grandest moments to memories. Marcus smiled faintly. That is my profession after all, watching things become memories. Lyssa leaned back in her chair, looking up at the stars again. Do you ever wish, she asked, that you could step outside of time for a while, just to rest, without the past or the future pressing in? Marcus thought about it. I think, he said slowly, that rest only has meaning because time continues. Otherwise, it would simply be emptiness. She considered this, then nodded. A sudden burst of laughter echoed from the far end of the hall as someone accidentally triggered a decorative hologram, filling the air with floating images of ceremonial birds that flapped in slow, majestic loops. A maintenance drone immediately descended, attempting to corral the projections, which only seemed to make them multiply. Marcus watched the spectacle with quiet amusement. I believe, he said, that history will record this evening as the night of the escaped birds. Lyssa laughed softly, and for a moment the weight of crowns and expectations seemed to vanish entirely. The hall grew quieter still as more guests departed, until only a few scattered groups remained. The chandeliers dimmed further, their light now gentle and subdued, and the vast space felt almost intimate, as though the great hall itself were growing tired. Marcus realized with a faint sense of wonder that he had never spent such a long time in the Queen's company before, nor had he ever felt so at ease in a place he had always found oppressive. Lyssa turned to him, her expression thoughtful but calm. Thank you, she said. For what? For this evening, she said simply. Marcus shook his head slightly. I have done nothing. Yes, she said. Exactly. And in that quiet exchange beneath the fading lights and the distant stars, both of them understood that sometimes the greatest gift one person could give another was not advice or assistance or power, but the simple, rare comfort of being allowed to exist without pretense. By the time the last musicians finished packing their instruments, the great hall had grown almost quiet. The vast space that had once shimmered with movement now held only scattered conversations, the soft hum of the environmental systems, and the faint, distant vibrations of the city beyond its walls. Marcus became aware that the evening, which had seemed to stretch endlessly, was finally drawing to a close. Servitors moved discreetly between tables, collecting empty glasses and dimming lights in gradual stages, as though careful not to disturb the lingering calm. Lyssa sat beside him, her hands folded loosely on the table, watching the last guest depart. There was no trace of the earlier strain in her expression now. Instead, she looked thoughtful, almost peaceful, as if something within her had settled. "I had forgotten," she said quietly, "what it felt like to pass an evening without measuring every word." Marcus considered this. "I suspect," he said, "that most of the court has spent the entire evening measuring every word about us." Lyssa smiled faintly. "Almost certainly." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, and Marcus realized that he was reluctant to leave. The hall, which had always felt vast and impersonal, now seemed strangely familiar, as though the quiet conversation they had shared had reshaped the space itself. A figure approached, one of the senior ministers, a man whose patience and composure were legendary in the court. He bowed respectfully. "Your Majesty," he said, "the council wishes to know whether there are any instructions for the morning session." Lyssa thought for a moment. "Yes," she said calmly. "Tell them the morning session will begin 1 hour later than scheduled." The minister blinked, surprised but too disciplined to show it openly. "Of course, Your Majesty." He bowed again and departed. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You have just granted the entire council an unexpected hour of sleep." "They will use it to worry," Lyssa said. "That is also a form of rest," Marcus replied. She laughed softly. At last they both rose from the table. The movement felt significant, as though standing marked the end of something that could not be repeated in quite the same way. They began walking slowly across the hall together. The chandeliers above had dimmed to a soft golden glow, and their footsteps echoed faintly on the polished floor. As they reached the great entrance, Marcus hesitated. "Your Majesty," he said, "I should return to the archives. There is a shipment of records arriving tomorrow, and if I am not there, someone will almost certainly shelve them in chronological order instead of thematic order." Lyssa looked at him with mock seriousness. "A catastrophe of unimaginable proportions." "Civilizations have collapsed for less," Marcus said. They both smiled, but neither of them moved for a moment. "Marcus," she said quietly, "you asked me earlier how I endure this life. Tonight reminded me of the answer." "And what is that?" She met his eyes. "I endure it by remembering that beyond the crown, beyond the court, there are still people who see me, not as a symbol, not as a ruler, but simply as a person." Marcus felt an unexpected warmth in his chest. "I think," he said slowly, "that I understand something now as well." "What is that?" "That history is not only made by great events and grand decisions," he said. "Sometimes it is made by small choices, like where one sits." Lyssa inclined her head slightly, as if acknowledging a truth she already knew. They walked together through the quiet corridors of the palace. The walls here were lined with softly glowing panels that adjusted their brightness to match the rhythm of the night, and distant windows revealed the city far below, its lights scattered like fallen stars. At the entrance to the archival wing, they stopped. The familiar scent of paper and metal drifted faintly from the corridors beyond, and Marcus felt a sense of calm settle over him. "I will visit again," Lyssa said. "You are always welcome," Marcus replied. "Though I warn you, I am currently cataloging agricultural treaties from the outer provinces. The excitement is overwhelming." "I look forward to it," she said. He inclined his head in farewell, then turned and walked into the archives. The corridors were quiet, the preservation lights glowing softly along the shelves. Marcus paused for a moment, listening to the silence, and realized that something inside him had changed. He had always believed that his life, spent among records and forgotten histories, existed at the margins of the world, that the great currents of events flowed far above him, beyond his reach. But tonight had shown him something different. Even in the center of power, what people often needed most was not strategy or authority, but honesty, simplicity, and the rare comfort of being understood. Marcus smiled faintly to himself and returned to his work table. The star map still hovered there, its pale lines tracing forgotten routes across the darkness. He adjusted the projection, studying it with renewed interest, as though seeing it for the first time. Far above, in her private chambers, Lyssa stood at the window, looking out at the city and the endless stars beyond.